It is somewhere between the last hour of night and the first hour of morning, and 7 men are sitting in a boat on the Sea of Galilee with nothing to show for the entire night. They have been fishing since dark. This is not a hobby for them. At least 4 of the men in that boat had built their lives around this water long before they ever heard the words, "Follow me." They know the currents. They know where the fish move when the wind shifts. And still, after an entire night and night of casting and hauling and casting again, the nets come up empty. Not almost empty. Empty. There is something quietly humiliating about failing at the one thing you used to be good at. And the man in that boat who feels it most is Simon Peter, because Peter is the one who suggested they go fishing in the first place. Think about where he is in his own story. The tomb is already empty. He has already seen the risen Jesus more than once. The single most impossible event in human history has already happened, and Peter's response to it is to go back to the boat. Not in rebellion, not in unbelief. Something more familiar than that. Something more human. When a man has failed at the thing that mattered most, he tends to retreat to the thing he used to be able to do. Then the light begins to change. There is a figure standing on the shore, maybe 100 yards off, close enough to call out to, far enough that the faces blur in that gray half-light before sunrise. He asks whether they have caught anything. They tell him the truth. He tells them to throw the net on the other side of the boat. Now, on the surface, that is almost absurd advice. The kind of thing a man on land shouts at professionals on the water. But they do it, and the net becomes so heavy they cannot pull it into the boat. And in that instant, something happens in the mind of the disciple John. He has seen this before. Years earlier, at the very beginning on this same lake, after Sadkara, another night of catching nothing, there had been another impossible catch of fish. John recognizes not the face on the shore, but the pattern. He says 4 words that change the temperature of the whole morning. It is the Lord. And Peter, who is always the first to move, whether or not moving is wise, throws his outer garment around himself and goes into the water. He does not wait for the boat. He does not wait for the fish. He does not wait to rehearse what he is going to say to the man he swore he did not know. He swims. And when he comes up onto that beach, so hooked, out of breath, standing in front of Jesus for the first time since everything fell apart, John gives us a detail so small that most of us have read straight past it 100 times. There is already a fire burning. Not wood, not brush, not a bonfire of driftwood thrown together in a hurry. John is very specific about what kind of fire it is, and he uses a word for it that appears in only one other place in the entire New Testament. One other scene, one other night, one other fire. And Peter was standing beside that one too. If that connection is deliberate, then the most tender scene in the Gospels is also one of the most carefully constructed, and Jesus did something on that beach far more intentional than making breakfast. He built a memory. Before we go further, if you find these hidden details in Scripture as compelling as I do, take a second to subscribe. This channel exists for people who read the Bible slowly. And this is one of those stories that changes shape the closer you look at it. Now, let's look at that fire. Start with the strangest thing about it, which is not the Greek and not the theology. It is the logistics. Jesus is standing on a beach at dawn with a charcoal fire already burning, fish already cooking on it, and bread already there. Then he tells the disciples to bring some of the fish they have just caught, which raises a question no one asks out loud. Where did his fish come from? He did not need their catch. He was not waiting on their success in order to feed them. The meal was ready before the boat came in. Whatever else is happening on that shore, Jesus is not reacting to Peter's arrival. He is waiting for it. This was prepared. And a prepared fire, on a specific morning, for a specific man is not an accident of scenery. It is a setting. Someone chose it. Now, fires in the ancient world were not interchangeable. An open wood fire is bright, loud, smoky, unpredictable. It throws sparks and light, and it is what you build when you need to burn something. A charcoal fire is a different creature entirely. Charcoal is wood that has already been burned once, slowly, until everything volatile has been driven out of it. What is left glows rather than flames. It gives steady, close heat with very little smoke. It is what you cook over. It is what you huddle around in a courtyard on a cold night when you want warmth without a bonfire announcing itself. And it has a smell. That is not a poetic embellishment. That is chemistry. Charcoal smells nothing like a wood fire. It is denser, sweeter, more acrid. Anyone who has walked past a street grill in a city and been thrown without warning into a memory of their grandfather's backyard knows exactly what I am describing. Smell bypasses the part of the brain that reasons and goes almost directly to the part that remembers. It is the sense most tightly wired to recall, which means that when Peter came up out of that water, dripping and shaking, the first thing that reached him, before Jesus said a single word to him, may not have been the sight of Jesus at all. It may have been the smell of burning charcoal. And if that is true, then Peter did not walk into breakfast. He walked into the worst night of his life. To understand why, we have to leave the beach. We have to go back to a cold courtyard in Jerusalem, in the dark, a few weeks earlier, where there was another charcoal fire, and where Simon Peter stood close enough to it to warm his hands while he took himself apart, one sentence at a time. To feel what happens in that courtyard, you have to first hear what Peter said a few hours before it. They are at the table, or just leaving it, and Jesus tells them plainly that every one of them is going to fall away that night. He is not guessing. He quotes a prophet, "Strike the shepherd, and the sheep scatter," and Peter, hearing a prediction of collective failure, immediately removes himself from the group. Even if everyone else falls away, he says, "I never will." Read that slowly, because it is one of the most revealing sentences any disciple speaks in the Gospels. Peter is not merely claiming he will be brave. He is claiming he will be braver than the other 11 men in the room. His confidence is comparative. He has measured himself against his friends and concluded that whatever is coming, he will be the last one standing. Jesus answers him with a specificity that must have sounded almost cruel. Not, "You may struggle," and not, "Be careful." Before the rooster crows, "You will disown me 3 times." And Peter escalates. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." He means it. That is what makes this unbearable. Peter is not lying. He is not posturing for the room. He is a man who genuinely believes he knows the shape of his own courage because he has never yet been in a room where that courage cost him everything. There is another moment, recorded by Luke, that sits underneath all of this like a floor. Jesus tells Peter that Satan has asked to sift him like wheat, and then says something almost impossible to absorb. I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. Notice what Jesus does not pray. He does not pray that Peter will not be sifted. He does not pray that Peter will not fall. He prays that when it happens, the fall will not be final. And then he adds a phrase that changes everything, and that almost nobody notices in the moment, because it is buried in the middle of a warning. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. When you've turned back, not if, when. Before Peter has denied anything, Jesus has already spoken about his return. The restoration is scheduled before the failure occurs. Peter is standing in a room being told in advance that he will fail, that he will come back, and that he will have work to do on the other side of it. And he is so certain of himself that he argues with the prediction instead of hearing the promise. That is the man who walks into the courtyard. Now, the setting. Jesus has been arrested. The disciples have scattered exactly as predicted, but 2 of them follow at a distance. John tells us he knew the high priest's household, which is how they get through the gate at all. And Peter ends up in an outer courtyard, in the middle of the night, in the cold, surrounded by servants and guards and temple police. And John gives us the detail. The servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing there warming themselves. And Peter was standing with them, warming himself. Stop there for a moment, because that sentence is doing something quietly devastating. Peter is standing shoulder to shoulder with the men who arrested Jesus, sharing their heat. He is inside the light of their fire. And a charcoal fire, remember, is a low glow. It lights faces from underneath, close in, intimate. You cannot stand at a charcoal fire and remain anonymous. It illuminates precisely the people gathered closest to it, which is why the questions start. A servant girl at the gate looks at him and says something almost casual. Aren't you one of this man's disciples? It is not an accusation from a soldier. It is a girl asking a question, and Peter says, I am not. Then he moves to the fire, and there, in that huddle of warmth, others ask him the same thing. Aren't you one of them? Again, I am not. Then a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off earlier that night looks at him and says, Didn't I see you in the garden with him? And Peter denies it a 3rd time, and the other Gospels tell us he denied it with oaths and curses. He swear. Where's he? He does not even know the man. And immediately a rooster crows. Now, there is a long-running discussion among scholars about what exactly the cock crow signified in 1st century Jerusalem, whether it refers simply to a bird or to a marked time of night, a watch announcement. That debate is real, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. But notice that nothing in the emotional core of this scene depends on resolving it. What matters is that a sound Jesus named in advance arrives on a schedule, and Peter hears it. And then Luke gives us the line that has haunted readers for 2,000 years. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. That is all. No speech, no rebuke. Jesus is in custody, being moved between hearings, and somewhere in that transit he turns his head and finds Peter's face in the crowd around a charcoal fire. And Peter remembers, and he goes outside and weeps bitterly. Here is what I want you to hold on to, because it is going to matter enormously later. Peter's failure was not a technicality. It was not a small compromise he could reason away. He had been given a warning, an explicit one, with a countdown attached, and he had argued with it. he had promised to die. And when the pressure came, it did not even arrive in the form of a sword. It arrived in the form of a servant girl asking a question by a fire, and Peter folded. Anyone can be broken by torture. Peter was broken by conversation. And I think that is why this story has such a grip on people. Most of us have never been asked to die for anything, but almost all of us have been in a room where saying the true thing would have cost us something small. A little awkwardness, a little standing, a little warmth. And we chose the warmth. Peter stood at a fire and became a man he did not recognize. Now, hold that image, because we are going back to the beach. And when we get there, I want you to watch the word. Here is the textual detail. When John describes that fire in the courtyard, he does not use the ordinary Greek word for fire. Greek has a perfectly common word for it, beer, the word behind our English pyre. John does not use it. He writes anthrakia, a heap of burning coals, a charcoal fire, and in the entire New Testament that word appears exactly twice. Once in the courtyard, where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Once on the shore, where Jesus is waiting for him after the resurrection. Both times in John's Gospel. Both times with Peter standing in front of the coals. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where these kinds of videos usually overreach. The word anthrakia is not a rare or mystical term in Greek generally. It is an ordinary word for an ordinary thing, and it turns up in other Greek literature without any theological weight at all. The fact that it occurs only twice in the New Testament tells us something about the New Testament's vocabulary. It does not, by itself, prove authorial intent. And I want to be honest about that, because an argument that depends on a claim you cannot support is an argument that collapses the moment someone checks. But here is what we can say, and it is stronger than it first appears. John is not a careless writer. He is arguably the most deliberate of the 4 gospel writers. His narrative is full of intentional echoes, light and darkness, water, bread, I am statements that return in patterns. He chooses details the way a filmmaker chooses shots. He tells us Judas went out, and then adds 3 words that no other writer would bother with. And it was night. That is not weather reporting. That is a man who knows exactly what he is doing with a detail. So, when the same author, writing the same gospel, ends his story by placing Peter in front of the only other charcoal fire he has ever mentioned, after a night of failure in the dark, with a night of fishing that produced nothing, the repetition is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It may be the strongest kind of literary signal there is, not a statement, but a placement. John may simply be inviting the reader to notice, and once you notice, you cannot unnotice it. The whole scene changes shape. Because now the question is not linguistic, it is emotional. And it is much harder to answer. If you were going to restore a man who had failed you catastrophically, would you do it in a setting that recreated the smell of his worst night? Just think about how we actually handle these things. When someone we love has humiliated themselves, our instinct is to change the subject. Move the conversation somewhere neutral. Say, let's not talk about it. Choose a different restaurant, a different room, a different topic, anything to avoid triggering the memory. We treat forgetting as a kindness. Jesus does the opposite. He builds the fire. And I want to sit in the discomfort of that for a second, because there's a version of this story that is genuinely disturbing. There is a way to read it in which Jesus is making a point at Peter's expense, recreating the scene of the crime, forcing him to smell it again, and then asking him 3 questions to match his 3 denials. If a human being did that to you, you would call it what it is. You would call it cruelty dressed as reconciliation. So, which is it? Watch what Jesus actually does, and watch what he conspicuously does not do. They eat first. That is not a small thing. Jesus does not open with the conversation. He tells them to bring some fish. He hands out bread and fish, and there is a meal on that beach in the early morning light. John says none of the disciples dared to ask who he was because they knew. There is an almost unbearable quiet in that sentence. 7 men eating breakfast in silence with a resurrected man. Peter is sitting at that fire, warming himself, presumably, the same posture, the same coals, the same low glow on his face. The last night he sat like this, he was destroying himself. And then, when the meal is finished, Jesus speaks to him. And here is the first surprise. He does not use the name Peter. Simon, son of John. That is the name Peter had before any of this began. Not the name Jesus gave him, the name that means rock, but the name he was born with, the name of a fisherman from Bethsaida, with a father and a family and a boat. Jesus reaches past everything that has happened and addresses the man underneath the title. And then the question. Not why did you do it? Not do you understand what you cost me? Not are you sorry? Do you love me more than these? Now, scholars have argued for centuries about what these refers to. The other disciples, the fish, the boats, the whole life Peter had drifted back toward. All 3 readings are defensible, and I would not build anything load-bearing on any one of them. But notice the shape of the question regardless. It is comparative. And the last time Peter made a comparative claim about his own devotion, he said, "Even if all the others fall away, I will not." Jesus is bringing him back to the exact sentence that broke him. And listen to how Peter answers now. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Something has changed, and it is easy to miss because the words are so simple. Peter no longer measures himself against anyone. He does not say more than these. He does not say more than John, who is sitting right there. He drops the comparison entirely. And then he does something he has never done before in the entire gospel. He appeals to Jesus' knowledge instead of his own. You know, the old Peter's authority was his own certainty about himself. I am ready. I will never, even if I must die. The new Peter has no confidence in his own self-assessment at all, because he has tested it, and it failed, and he has heard what came out of his own mouth in a courtyard. So he stakes his answer on the only thing left that he still trusts, what Jesus can see in him that he cannot see in himself. That is not a smaller faith. That is a faith that has stopped depending on Peter. And Jesus answers him, but he does not say, "I forgive you." He says, "Feed my lambs." Then he asks again. If this is landing with you, drop a comment and let me know. I read them, and the conversations under these videos are genuinely some of the best on the internet. A like helps this reach other people who need to hear the second half of this story. Because the second half is where it stops being about Peter. Jesus asks a second time. Peter answers a second time. Same appeal, same surrender. You know that I love you. And Jesus gives him a second charge, tend my sheep, and then a third time. And John tells us Peter was grieved. That word matters. Peter was grieved because Jesus asked him the third time, not because the question was hard, because of the number. Somewhere in that third question, Peter understands what is happening. He is not being interrogated. He is being counted. 3 denials in the dark beside a charcoal fire. 3 questions in the light beside a charcoal fire. He hears the symmetry, and it lands on him with the full weight of everything he has been carrying since that night. There is a Greek detail here that gets discussed constantly, and I want to handle it honestly rather than dramatically. In the first 2 questions, Jesus uses one Greek verb for love, agapao, and Peter answers with a different one, phileo. In the third question, Jesus switches to Peter's word. Some interpreters build entire sermons on that shift. Jesus descending to meet Peter where he is. Other scholars point out that John swaps synonyms all through this passage. He uses 2 different words for sheep, 2 different words for know, 2 different words for feed, and argue the variation is stylistic rather than theological. That debate is real, and it is not settled, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Which is exactly why the argument should not rest there. Because underneath the vocabulary question is a structural fact that no translation and no lexicon can erase. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus asks Peter 3 times. And after every single answer, Jesus hands him something to do. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. 3 failures, 3 questions, 3 commissions. That is not an interrogation. That is a reconstruction, and it is being built with the same bricks that fell. Now go back to the question we left burning. Is this cruelty? Is Jesus rubbing Peter's face in it? Look at what is missing from the conversation. Jesus never asks Peter to explain himself. He never asks, why? He never asks Peter to promise it will not happen again, which is remarkable because a promise is exactly what got Peter into this. Jesus does not want another vow. He has heard Peter's vows. He knows what they are worth under pressure, and he knew it before Peter did. He asks one thing 3 times. Do you love me? And that question is not a test Peter can fail through weakness. It is not a question about capacity or courage or performance. It is a question about direction, about who Peter's heart is still turned toward after everything. That is the difference between shame and restoration. Shame asks, what did you do? Restoration asks, who are you turned toward now? And then, having it asked it, Jesus does something that should genuinely stagger us. He gives Peter his sheep. Understand what that means from Jesus' own vocabulary. Earlier in this same gospel, Jesus had called himself the Good Shepherd, the one who lays down his life for the sheep, in contrast to the hired hand who runs when the wolf comes, and who, in the entire New Testament, has more publicly behaved like a man who runs when the danger arrives than Simon Peter. Jesus takes the man with the most documented failure of nerve in the Gospels and puts him in charge of the flock. That is not Jesus overlooking Peter's failure. That is Jesus building on the far side of it. A man who has discovered exactly how far his own courage extends is a very different shepherd than a man who still believes he is unbreakable. Peter is now permanently incapable of despising a failure in someone else, because he has been one in public, with witnesses on the record forever. Jesus did not restore Peter in spite of what he learned that night. He restored him with it. And then, in the same conversation, Jesus tells him something almost unbearable, that when Peter is old, he will stretch out his hands and be led where he does not want to go. John tells us plainly what that meant, the kind of death Peter would die. The very thing Peter had boasted he was ready bent and proved he was not, is quietly given back to him as a future he will actually walk into. The promise Peter broke is returned to him as a promise Jesus makes about him. And then 2 words. The same 2 words Jesus said to Simon the fisherman on this same shore. At the beginning, before any of it. Follow me. Not start over. Not try again. The original call, unretracted. Which brings us back to the fire. Notice what the fire is not doing on that beach. It is not erasing anything. Jesus does not tell Peter to forget the courtyard. He does not say, let's put it behind us. He does not pretend it did not happen. He walks Peter straight back into the sensory center of his worst night and stands there with him in it. That is the thing I cannot get past. There was a version of restoration available that involved silence. A warm greeting, a changed subject, a failure that everyone politely agrees not to mention, sitting between them for the rest of their lives. Peter would have taken that. Most of us would have taken that. Jesus gives him something harder and infinitely better. He takes the memory Peter would have paid anything to delete, and he changes what it means. Because from that morning forward, Peter cannot smell burning charcoal without remembering the courtyard. That is how memory works. That never goes away. But now he also cannot smell it without remembering the beach. Both fires live in the same sense, and the second one is the one that has the last word. The failure still happened. That matters enormously, and I want to be clear about it because there is a cheap version of this story that says your failure did not really matter. The Gospels say the opposite. It mattered so much that Peter went out and wept bitterly. It mattered enough that Jesus counted it out, one question at a time, until Peter grieved. Nothing here is minimized. It simply is not final. And this is where the story stops being about a fisherman in the 1st century. Because you have a charcoal fire. I do not know what it is. It might be a room you cannot walk past. A song. A season of the year that arrives every 12 months carrying the same weight. A message you sent. A promise you made in complete sincerity and then broke more than once. A version of yourself you swore you would never become, standing in a moment where saying the true thing would have cost you a little warmth, and you chose the warmth. Maybe you have spent years trying to build a life far enough away from that fire that you never have to smell it again. And maybe some part of you has quietly concluded that whatever you were supposed to be for God, you disqualified yourself from it on the night you failed. Peter believed that too. That is what the boat was. That is why a man who had seen the risen Christ went back to fishing. Not because he stopped believing, but because he could not imagine what use he could still be. And Jesus came to the shore before dawn and built the fire and waited for him. Here is the thing about that morning that I think we consistently get backward. We read it as Peter being forgiven. But Jesus had never stopped calling him. Remember what the angel said at the empty tomb. Go tell his disciples and Peter. 2 extra words, added by name, for the one man who was certain he had been written out. The first fire was where Peter discovered how badly he could fail. The second fire was where Peter discovered that Jesus had always known how badly he could fail, had said so out loud in advance to his face, and came looking for him anyway. Jesus did not want a different Peter. He restored the one who fell. And then he handed him a job. Peter's worst memory became the address where Jesus came to find him. If you have read John 21 before and never noticed that there were 2 fires, tell me in the comments. I would genuinely like to know what this changed for you, and if it did change something, or helps it reach the next person who needs it. There is another video appearing on your screen right now that goes deeper into the night this all began, into the courtyard, the warning, and the sound Peter never forgot. If this one landed, that one belongs beside it. I will see you there.